Well, our next writer is Sigrid Nunez here, and we have Elizabeth Blair from National Public Radio who will be doing the conversation, and I want to welcome you both to our fiction stage.
It's an honor to be here, and thank you for coming, and also thank you to the Library of Congress for putting on this spectacular festival, and to the James Madison Council for sponsoring this stage. Sigrid Nunez has published 7 novels, including A Feather on the Breath of God, The Last of Her Kind, and Salvation City. She has received numerous honors, including the Whiting Writers Award, a Berlin Prize, and the Rome Prize in Literature. Her most recent novel, The Friend, won the 2018 National Book Award. When NPR's Scott Simon interviewed Sigrid, he said this: "The Friend is a taut, lyric little novel on the enormous questions of love, loss, and art, and even the question of how to love an enormous dog." So Sigrid and I will chat for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. So feel free to be thinking now what you might like to ask her. So I read that you said you do not do outlines before you start. Is that true?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've always worked on my books in exactly the same way. I start with some kind of idea or image or character. I start at the beginning. I do not make any kind of outline, and I'm not tempted to make an outline. And then I just start writing without really knowing what's going to come next. And I try to get a section as good as I can before moving on. So I kind of grope my way forward intuitively and try not to become too attached to ideas I might have for the far future of the book. So that by the time I finish it, I don't really need to do extensive revisions. I just have to do polishing and fixing things, fixing errors I might have made because it's finished when I've come to the end of that process. And I rarely know what's going to happen at the very end of the book until I'm actually there.
It's sort of hard to believe, but it's incredible, and I'm wildly impressed. What was the starting point for The Friend?
Well, with The Friend, it was interesting because what happened was that the time had come for the BU faculty reading. And because there are several of us, they only wanted us to read for a maximum of 10 minutes. And I wanted to write something new. Of course, I realized it didn't have to be something finished. I would just kind of present it as, this is an excerpt from a longer work. And so I sat down and wrote what are basically the first 5 pages or so of the book. And some of the things that had been on my mind was that I had discovered in the past several years that I knew several people who had the idea of suicide on their minds. They weren't threatening it, they weren't planning it, they weren't screaming for help. It wasn't that, but it was like part of their way of thinking. It had become an idea, that might well be the way my story ends. And in fact, I had actually finished the book when one of those people did take his life. So that was very much on my mind. And then I was also interested, I have a passion for animals, and I'd always wanted to write something that had an animal, particularly a dog, at the heart of it. And then all these years now that what have I been doing? I've been writing, thinking about writing, reading, and teaching writing. And I started to see the possibility of being able to use that material in this same book. And then I had, I'm a little bit ahead of myself because I want to say that around the same time that I was doing the BU faculty reading, I was asked to read at the University of Maryland, and they wanted 25 minutes. So I kept on to that, and by the time those pages were done, I knew that I was launched on something that could be a novel, and then I just pulled all these things that I'd been thinking about I saw how I could braid all those themes together. See, so an outline would not have done, it would have been a whole other project then.
That's right. You're responding to the client.
Yeah.
5 minutes? Okay, now 25 minutes. Okay. I mean, suicide is such a difficult and hard topic. And I am curious kind of what you learned as you were reading about it and what your own personal feelings were about it.
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, I hope that is all in there in the book, but I never felt at any point that I was going to be able to come up with any kind of satisfying answers. You know, as people say, somebody who attends the funeral of a suicide in my book says, well, I was hoping for closure, and somebody says, well, when you know, if there even is such a thing ever as closure in these dramatically emotional situations, but when the person commits suicide, then there really is no hope for closure. But I did, you know, my narrative does a certain amount of reading and discovers about suicide, discovers all kinds of interesting things. For example, quite shockingly, since the book is in the first person, she discovers that writing in the first person is a known suicide risk. But in the end, you know, she says that nothing that anyone said to her or that she read about was really all that helpful. The thing really remained a mystery because it's just so, you know, self-homicide. It's so against the normal way of things that it, you know, and of course there are different reasons why people commit suicide. But, you know, I wanted to talk about it, I wanted to reflect on it, but I never thought that it would ever come to anything truly satisfying where I would say, well, now I understand. No, I don't understand.
Something I love about the beginning of the book is that right away we understand how connected the narrator is to the man who committed suicide. He was a mentor, briefly a lover. He has a great sense of humor. He's a real character. And I was wondering if he's modeled on anyone you know or knew.
Certainly no one in particular. I never had that person in my own life. I've had mentors. My important mentors have all been women. But he's a very recognizable type, particularly from his era, this sort of womanizing professor with lots of good things about him, but also kind of clueless about how things have changed over the decades. And for example, his throwing a fit because with complete politeness, the women in his class had said, could you please not call us dear? And his view is, I've been calling them dear for decades and no one has ever complained. And now every single one of those women has signed this letter asking, I mean, that sort of thing. And I also was, as I say in the book, I was very much thinking of a fictional character when I was writing about this man, which is the David Lurie, the protagonist of J.M. Coetzee's novel Disgrace, which is a book that I greatly admire, one of my favorite books, and you know, and I use that in the book to talk about my own character. They have many of the same characteristics, the same proclivities, etc. So yeah, but it was definitely not based on anyone I knew. No.
Although reading it, I thought, this is ripped from the headlines. And I certainly work with men of a certain age who, you know, say dear and they mean nothing by it, or honey, or darling.
Well, in this particular incident, with the problem was that they were his students. It was even, you know, trying to make him understand that that it made them uncomfortable, which he didn't understand, and part of or refused to understand, and part of the story there is that when because the narrator and the mentor are close in age. He was her professor, but he was very, very, very young when he was her professor. And now they've remained friends over all these decades. And when she tries to take the side of the students, he turns on her and he says, "You're such a hypocrite. You loved it when I called you dear."
That's right. And there is quite a bit of that in the novel, the sort of, not hypocrisy, but it's... Nuance, yes, nuance. Right. And I was wondering if with relationships between writing students and teachers who are almost always writers themselves, it probably lends itself even more to these kinds of complexities around sex, around inspiration, and I'm just, did you want to get at that at all?
Well, I mean, things have changed, thank goodness, but I mean, I can remember being a student myself, or even it had nothing to do with my being a student, but back in a certain time, I mean, I've known of many marriages that began because the woman was the student of the professor, and those marriages, and there was no rule in the university against that, and at that time, and when those marriages happened, they've been as successful and happy as other marriages. But I guess there's something about, I mean, that is sort of what I wanted to talk about was what happens to somebody when they don't understand what changes are happening and why. I mean, it contributes to his depression, and in that sense, it contributes to his own destruction.
Mm-hmm. I saw a video that you gave when it was at Baruch. You had been a teacher at Baruch, and you were talking about your own teachers and how the blunt talk of the teachers that you had and how things have really changed. And I was thinking of Elizabeth Hardwick, and I'm just wondering if you can share some of the things that she would say to you or to other students.
Well, talk about things changing. I mean, just the way, you can't be that womanizing professor anymore and feel that you have a right. There are things that no writing teacher, I would imagine, would say to their students about their work. I mean, let me just say the kinds of things. Elizabeth Hardwick is somebody I took 2 fiction workshops with at Barnard. And it was quite overwhelming. And she would say the harshest things that I can't imagine ever saying to a student. And one of them was, "I tried to read your story. I did, I really did. But I just couldn't. It was just so boring." And then another student, she had said to him about his piece, "I'd rather shoot myself than read that again." and this was a regular thing, and she was very funny, but she was absolutely serious. She had no patience. She had no tolerance for bad work, but the problem was, I mean, I was an undergraduate. Okay, not quite. I was between graduate and undergraduate and graduate, and I brought her a story. I mean, she was at Barnard, then I was at Columbia, so I went to her office to give her a story I'd written after I had graduated. And she read it, and she said, she was so angry. I have to say, first of all, she was so angry with the story, with me for writing it. And she said, "Do you know what I see in your work? I see the mark of the amateur on every page." And I was an amateur. I was like, I was a student. So yeah, exactly. So these things certainly do stay with you. But as I say, it's like I just, of course, I would never say anything like that to any of my students, no matter how much I might feel that everything is wrong. And yes, sometimes everything is wrong.
I once had an editor say, well, it's serviceable. That piece is serviceable. Like, ooh. I love your Kentucky accent, by the way.
Oh, yes.
And I wanted to ask you about your upbringing. You grew up on Staten Island?
I did.
And I'm just curious about your parents.
Yep. Immigrant parents. My father was half Chinese, half Panamanian, and my mother was German. And my father was, my mother grew up in Germany and was there during the Nazi regime and the war. And my father was an illegal resident of Chinatown because he was half Panamanian, but he was Chinese identified. That was his language. That was his community. He worked in Chinatown in a restaurant. When the war broke out, the U.S. Army came for him and said, we need you to go to war, and by the way, we're going to make you a citizen at the same time. And they did, and so then he was with the occupying forces in southern Germany, which is where he met my mother, and they ended up coming here, first to the Fort Greene housing project, and then when I was about 2, they moved to the housing project on Staten Island, which is where I grew up until I went to Barnard and started boring the hell out of Elizabeth Hardwick.
Were they big readers?
Were
they avid readers the way you are, your parents?
Avid readers? No. We didn't have. Well, no, that's not fair. There were not a lot of books in the house where I grew up, and my father certainly did not read. My father's English was never very good. My mother, although she always had a very heavy accent, her English was good, and yes, she actually wasn't. I would call her an avid reader. She didn't have the time, but she did. She did love to read. Yeah.
And what did they think when you said, I'm going to be a writer?
I was an English major. I don't even think I said that I was going to be a writer.
I think
I was writing, the way people do. I remember there was a creative writing program in my junior high school, and then of course Barnard. So I was always involved in some kind of creative writing, and it always went well. There was always encouragement. But my father died before I ever published a book. But yeah, they were certainly, I certainly didn't have the kind of thing that you sometimes have, where some of my students, who say to me, as one did, she was Chinese American. She said, when you're Chinese American, you tell your Chinese parents that you're going to be an English major. They cry.
Right.
They cry. It's hard. It's hard. There's that kind of resistance, which I think is changing.
Yeah.
But I didn't encounter anything like that.
So in The Friend, there's this Great Dane who is a character, we could say, in the book. Did you have pets growing up?
I did grow up somewhere where no dogs were allowed, no pets were allowed in that project where I grew up. But when I was already out of the house, my family did get a Great Dane, very large one, Taurus, his name was, appropriately. And so I had some time with him, but he was certainly not my dog. And by that time, I had become a cat person. And I did have roommates, friends, boyfriends, etc., with whom I shared space with their dogs. But I really do think of, and I love dogs, but I never had an Apollo. I never had a dog like this that was my dog.
So what was the inspiration for Apollo? Was it the Great Dane that you'd had before, or did you see a Great Dane walking down the...
That's interesting, because as I say, that's what I mean. This book is, maybe you're 30 pages into the book, and remember, I write it like that, groping along, not knowing what comes next. And I had the idea that after the suicide, wife 3 says, I want to talk to you about something, and they meet. That's when the dog came in. The dog was not there before page 30 or whatever it is. I can't remember. Like, I thought it was exactly like that. Oh, I know what could happen. What if? Will that work? So yeah, so I can't, but then long after I finished the book, I did remember that there used to be this gallery space that had become a cafe on Green Street in Manhattan. And I used to walk down there from the village where I was living because you could sit there forever working with a cup of coffee. And very often I saw a woman, she came in with this huge Harlequin Dane and a much smaller dog. And she was so kind, she understood. She would find herself a place, and then the dogs would settle down, and once the Dane was there, I would get up from where I was and go be with the Dane for a while. I didn't even ask her. I figured if she didn't like it, she would say something, but she didn't. She just, there's that lady again. And I hadn't thought about that dog in years because this was really a long time ago. But surely that was one of the reasons, because it was a regular thing that I did.
Yeah.
I love that dog.
And there's a lot in the book. You seem to have done a lot of research about what other writers have said about dogs, what sort of animal science has said about the relationship between humans and animals. What were some of the things that you learned that surprised you or that you were moved?
I didn't actually do research. I guess the truth is I've always been interested in animals and animal-human relations, and particularly canine-human relations, even without being a big dog person. So anything that I would have learned in the course of my life, my reading, I would remember it. And then I would think, oh, isn't there that interesting fact about so-and-so? And then I would look it up. So I can't think of anything right now that, I didn't know, oh, this is interesting. I named the dog Apollo. And after I named the dog Apollo, I discovered that the Great Dane is known as the Apollo of dogs. That kind of coincidence, which often happens when you're writing. Like writing in the first person is a known suicide risk. That was a complete coincidence. So, so that kind of thing. But a lot of it, like the things that Rilke had said about dogs, I've always known that.
Share that with...
Well, he loved dogs, and so they appear a lot in his work. And there was just one very beautiful anecdote. It's in a letter that he wrote to someone where he was sitting in a cafe in Spain somewhere, and there was this stray, very ugly, unwanted dog that was very, very heavily pregnant, obviously homeless. And he gave the dog the sugar lump from his coffee, and he said it was like taking mass together. It was so memorable and so Rilke. And whenever I read that, which would have been a very long time ago, I never forgot it. And then when I was writing the book, which, as I say, I like that freedom of just kind of sitting with the book, thinking my thoughts as I write, and then remembering things and pulling them in. It's that kind of book. It's a meditative book, so you couldn't do this with another type of story. But that's how those things would come to me. I didn't sort of sit down and say, now I should research Great Danes, and I did know quite a bit about Great Danes anyway. Yeah.
Well, as a dog owner, there's a scene in the book that I loved, which is you're talking about how dogs are more loyal to their human than they are to other dogs. Like,
Oh, definitely.
right?
They hate other dogs. Often they hate. They can be so unfairly hostile to other dogs, as we know.
That's the scene when you're walking your dog and you see someone else walking their dog, and the dog looks like, well, in the book, the dog in question, you imagine the dog spewing all kinds of obscenities to the other dog. And I was like, that is exactly what happens when I walk my dog. I see another dog and it looks like it's gonna snap off its leash.
Right. I mean, they don't always do it, but they sort of lunge it. I mean, they're strangling to death just to get that other dog, and it's like they're saying, I hate you. Yeah. It's a good thing I'm on this leash. If I wasn't on this leash, I would rip your balls off.
That's the G-rated version. In the book, it's way saltier. It's great. It's a beautiful moment. And I have to say...
It is funny. It's very funny.
It's very funny. Just for the record, our dog is not like that.
And Apollo is not like
Apollo
that,
is
which
not
is
like
why she brings it up.
That's right. This book, as I think other books, you write a lot about the writing life, which is solitary, and you don't have to deal with people except for your characters, and you really like that, I think. You like that, not just your narrator.
I like writing
Just the
about
privacy, you've talked about being a private person, and I think it was in Rouenna, forgive me, I don't pronounce the book.
Rouenna, yeah.
Rouenna, you describe this scene where, I'm sitting, it's winter, I'm looking out of the window, I have my cat on my lap, I'm writing. This is just where I want to be.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm actually recovering from bronchitis, so I'm sorry about the coughing, but I am going to have to cough a little bit here. Ugh, mic'd cough.
She told me ahead of time not to take that personally if she did that. No.
Well, yeah, I mean, my feeling was always that I actually became a writer, partly because for the solitude. I mean, the idea was that it was something that I could do by myself, in a room. I wasn't one of those people who wanted to become a writer or do whatever they were doing, to be part of a community. But then what I discovered was that writing, like other arts, is an ideal way to be, I'm sorry, to have solitude and be part of a community at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You don't romanticize the writing life at all in this book. You talk about, writers who've said, writers are monsters, and what's the Joan Didion quote? Writers are always selling somebody out.
Yeah, I did find that I had a quite a collection of these incredibly negative things that people had said about writers. I mean, even things like John Updike saying, and they were just in my head. John Updike saying, a nice person just wouldn't become a writer. Yeah. And there were just a lot of those. And then my narrator who says, not my narrator, my mentor character who says that every time he writes something and then gives it up because, and leaves it aside and thinks, forget that. Then when he goes back to it, he can't resist this awful thought that it's like a dog returning to its vomit. Writers have incredibly colorful ways of talking about what a terrible life it is. I mean, Georges Simenon, for example, who said it's a profession of unhappiness, being a writer. And when he was asked, why did you become a writer? I mean, this man who wrote hundreds and hundreds of books, who was for quite a while the best-selling author in the world, and who's so gifted. Why did you become a writer? What made you be a writer? Hatred for my mother, he said. Whatever that means.
And why did you become a writer?
Well, I became a writer because of reading. I became a writer because when I was young, the thing that was most enchanting to me was to be read to first, before I could read, and then to read, and the kinds of things, children's books about animals in particular, fairy tales, mythology, all of this, to me, it was just wonderful, and terrific escape, among other things. I mean, when you start reading something, you're alone, but you're also with another person. I think that's very important. It's not just for children; that's for anybody. And you're like borrowing somebody else's consciousness for a while, which is very exciting. But so there I was, and I thought, okay, this makes me really happy, and this is what I want to do when I grow up. I want to do the same, to write stories like this. And so for a very long time, I thought that I would write children's books because that's what I was reading, and that's what made me happy. I mean, there are a few writers, not many, who weren't big readers when they were little. But I think most writers are. I mean, it's that love. It's hard for me to imagine what would make you want to be a writer without that. And that is a change that I find very significant and disturbing. When I was in, let's say, the MFA program at Columbia, it would have been unheard of for someone to say that they didn't like books, they didn't like reading, but they want to be a writer. That's why they're in this MFA program. But I and my colleagues have all heard at least one student, and there seems to be more as time goes by. It is by no means unusual anymore to have a graduate writing student say, I don't like to read. In fact, I dislike reading. I have no interest in reading. I just want to write. I mean, it's a huge mystery to me, but it's there. It's there, and I try to compare it to, I mean, and there's a certain disdain for writers that these people have, that a lot of young writers have. Kind of like those dogs going at each other. There's this disdain, and I try to imagine, I mean, it would be impossible to imagine a very young dancer looking at the glorious stars of the New York City Ballet and having that kind of disdain for them. It's impossible to imagine a young athlete looking at watching the Olympics and having disdain for the gold medalists. It makes no sense, but you do have, among younger writers, it's not uncommon to have this disdain for writers, the writing profession, and for books in general, and to not want to read. It's quite mysterious. It's odd.
Well, fortunately, that's not this crowd. And let's open it up for some questions.
Yes.
There are microphones there. And I see somebody running.
Okay. I'm over here.
Okay.
One of the things that I admired about The Friend was the narrator's expression of real emotional restraint in the face of everything that she was describing. And, given what you've told us about the way that you develop your books, did you intend for her to be what I read as, emotionally restrained in a way that was sort of delightfully mysterious? You weren't never quite sure whether or not she was trying to consciously hold back, or she was in the face of loss, which the book, concatenates over the course, or whether or not this was just an expression of her character, that this was her.
Well, for one thing, I am a writer who admires a certain restrained style. That's why J.M. Coetzee is one of my favorite writers. I think there's something about when you're writing about, particularly when you're writing about difficult things or very emotional things, you know, I just think it's more effective to have that restraint. I think you can show an enormous amount of emotion by being restrained. It's like Chekhov has said many wonderful things, you know, that could be called advice to young writers. And one of the things that he has said is that the trick is to write perfectly coldly about that the hottest thing there is, which is love. You know, and he's also said, when you want to touch the writer's heart, try being a little bit colder. And that, I think, you know, and I mean, he didn't explain it, as far as I know, but I feel like I know what he meant, and I feel like as a reader, that is what moves me most. For me, that's the most effective way to get at that. I also think that there needs to be a certain amount of humor. Because humor is part of of every human experience, even really horrifying ones. If you leave the humor out, you're leaving out something essential. So, you know, so again, this wasn't anything I planned. I just started writing it in a certain voice, style, and tone, which came naturally to me, and then I just wanted to keep it consistent. And if there was any time when I felt it was getting, you know, it was getting too whatever, I would try, you know, as Chekhov said, to be a little bit colder.
Okay. Oh, so I can see.
Hi. So I'm over here.
Over where?
So I graduated also from Columbia, and I had a lot of friends who went to Barnard, and I was very jealous of them. And you talked often in this half hour about your experience as a Barnard and then a Columbia MFA student. And I think if I were a young lady, I would have loved to go to Barnard as well. But can you talk a little bit about what stuck with you from that experience? Because if you went to Barnard and Columbia, you can kind of sense that influence in the book, and then you mentioned it a couple times. So, like, what's the one thing from going to a small women's college like Barnard in a particular place that kind of influenced you and stuck with you?
Well, I was very happy to be at this women's college. Now, at that time, Columbia was not admitting women, but it was a little bit. That came a few years after I graduated, but. You know, the size of the school was great, and you know, the intimacy of you know, of actually living, you know, in the dorm and in that space, but in the midst of, you know, this great big city. But I think it's different from what would be other women's schools because Columbia didn't admit women, but like we were free to take any courses we wanted at Columbia, pretty much, and they, of course, could take our courses. So it was, as far as like maybe the living arrangement, and they were right across the street. I mean, it's all the same campus. So I think for me it was like the best of both worlds. I did like being in that smaller college. I did like it. I did like the single-sex college aspect of it. But you know, you could also you could live it as a co-ed.
So is there something from that you took that you like still keep with you in your writing today, or?
Well, that is, I would say, for example, because of studying with Elizabeth Hardwick, you know, that was that was a place where I became a different kind of writer in the sense that, you know, before that, I think I can safely say it was all fun. I don't think anyone ever really criticized anything that I wrote in high school. I really don't, I can't remember, and I doubt it, because that's just not the way writing was taught or the arts were taught. And my feeling is that when I got to Barnard, and not just with Elizabeth Hardwick, you know, it was adulthood, and that was when it hit me what Thomas Mann meant when he said, a writer is somebody for whom writing is harder than it is for other people. And that's when it struck me, oh, it isn't fun. you know what I've gotten myself into. It's actually something with some incredibly dark, frightening aspects. And that's also when the idea of, oh, success, failure. I never thought of it that way. I thought it was just success. You wrote, people liked it, that kind of thing. So yeah, so that certainly, I mean, yeah, it's where I became a serious writer.
Thank you.
Whoever's next.
Hi.
You can't see out there.
Oh, I'm to your left.
Okay.
Yes, hi. So first of all, thank you so much. I really loved this book. My book club covered it most recently, and there's so many layers to it and so many thoughts and questions. But one thing in particular I'd be curious on getting your thoughts on is...
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
Okay, so
Yeah,
sorry.
thank
I'll
you.
get closer. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Again, I love the book, and my book club read it a month ago. And something that, while I was reading it, and I don't know if you did this intentionally or if it was part of your process, but not until late in the story, when you told a story in the story about characters remaining nameless, and then the light bulb went off that, except for Apollo, the dog, everybody was nameless. And I'm wondering if, I've read books before where the first person narrator never had a name. But I've never read a book where nobody had a name, and I certainly didn't notice it along the way until you kind of provided that light bulb. And I thought that maybe it's a great writing tool in that you're not distracted by the names. You're not sort of having to code. When someone has a name or a label, wife 2, wife 3, I mean, it can come across as harsh, but you don't have to remember, oh wait, Lucinda, which one is she? So I guess I was just wondering if that was something you set out to do on purpose, or if it just happened organically.
Well, for one thing, I don't actually think that, when I do my reading of all different kinds of books, I don't think that it's distracting to have names. Most books do. I do know that it's a little bit more common now for characters and not just narrators to not be named. You're seeing it more and more. What happened with me was I didn't, as I say, I never plan anything. I got started. At a certain point, people did have names, not the narrator, but they did have names. Like the mentors in the beginning, so he had a name. And what happened was something that I've heard other writers say the same thing. When I would try to write with these names, the story got weighed down. It didn't feel right. It felt fake. Something about those names was not working. And the book was telling me that by making my writing not fluent. And when I took the names out, the problem was solved. So it was just, it was just trial and error. I thought, well, of course they have names. So I'm not going to write a whole book without any names. Apollo I always knew. But that's all that happened. It was something that I discovered in the book. And so for that book, it's the case. In other books I've written, people have had names, and the names have actually been important ones.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. What do you think? One more question?
Thank you so much for being here today. I have a two-part question. One is, who are some of your favorite authors that have inspired you? And what are 2 to 3 books that you've read recently that really touched you?
Well, I always, this thing about favorite writers, I find it very hard to answer because, there was a period in my life where I had favorite writers. I mean, there was the period when I was very young when Dickens was a favorite writer. There was a period when I was in college where Virginia Woolf was certainly a favorite writer. But but there are so many people that I read, and life is long, and I realize that I actually don't have favorite writers anymore. I just, I just have very broad taste, and I enjoy different writers for different reasons. So, and if I were even to mention somebody, I feel like, well, why that one and not all these others? But I am happy to actually say, because, what have you, I'm always asking people, well, what have you read lately and so on. So 2 books that I've read that are current, that I've been very happy with, fiction novels. there's a brand new book just out this month right now called The Grammarians by Kathleen Shine, which I read in manuscript some time ago, which I just thought was wonderful, funny and brilliant and interesting in all kinds of ways. And maybe 6 months ago or so, I read Trust Exercise by Susan Choi, a completely different kind of novel, but also I was just absolutely delighted with it. So those are two people I could come up with. But
Thank you.
Right. Good. I think, okay. So Sigrid will be signing books at 1:30 in where? Lower level, line 3. I'm told it's all the way in the back. But thank you so much.
thank
This
you.
has been
Thank
fantastic.
you. What a lovely audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.